On December 4, 2017, the draft of the new Arizona State Science Standards was scheduled to be presented to the State Board of Education and then released for public review. This process was delayed pending an internal review, and the standards were ultimately presented to the State Board of Education on March 26, 2018. Before reviewing the standards, it is important to understand the revision process and the framework the committee was working under. Ultimately, the State Board of Education is responsible for adopting standards for all content areas in Arizona. The K-12 Standards section of the Department of Education is in charge of managing the revision process. They have provided focus, structure, and guidance for working groups as the groups revise and craft new standards. The process began in 2016 with public feedback on the current standards. ADE brought together working groups to review the past standards, public feedback, and current research in science, pedagogy, and education. With the delay in the standards, some of these endpoints will probably have to be adjusted. To the working groups, the directives were that the standards were for Arizona standards were written for Arizona teachers and students by Arizona educators and content experts. They were directed to write grade level standards and not performance objectives. As the working groups revised the standard, they were continually reminded about the focus of their work. The Department of Education adopts standards that determine what a student should know, but the how is left to the school districts to decide. We were directed that the new standards would not include performance objectives. The old performance objectives became more of a checklist. Grade levels and courses could exceed 50 performance objectives, presenting a nearly insurmountable task for teachers and students. The focus had shifted away from larger conceptual learning into memorizing discrete facts or practicing skills in isolation. The new standards would shift our focus back to the larger concepts and the interconnectivity of science. This graphic represents the initial process that the working groups operated under. In the March 26th presentation to the school board, this version was updated into what you see on your screen. In this new timeline, Superintendent Douglas added 2 periods of internal review. Up until this internal review, the standards review process had been fairly transparent. Directions to the working group and minutes from the work sessions were publicly available on the ADE website. The working groups operated on an accordion model where team members cycled in and out of teams to allow for both continuity and the addition of new team members. When smaller group work teams wrote the plus standards for high school, the work was brought back to the larger team for evaluation and refinement. This transparency ended with the internal review. Meeting agendas and minutes were not published, and the edits were not reviewed by the standards working team. During the week prior to the State Board of Education meeting, science leaders from around the state met in 2 sessions to review the draft standards. Some concerns expressed by this group included the lack of transparency regarding the internal review, the inclusion of key concepts, and the way some of the revisions changed the standards. As previously stated, a direction to the working group was that the standards should reflect the larger concepts in science rather than the minutiae that was detailed in our current state standards. The performance objectives dictated curriculum, which is under the purview of each district. By including key concepts in the draft, the work done to broaden the standards has been negated. The key concepts can actually limit what districts perceive they should be teaching, even though the document states that the standard is not limited to these concepts. During the State Board of Education meeting, Superintendent Douglas was asked about changes that were made during the internal review. She stated that changes were not restricted to grammatical corrections, and that the content changes made reflected what she felt should be made. She stated several times that she would not bring standards to the board that she felt were inappropriate. To hear further what was said at the State Board of Education meeting, please click the resource link below the video on this page. The State Board did address the internal review and requested a copy of the standards that showed what was changed from the draft completed by the Standards Working Group. The draft is entitled Draft with Internal Review Arizona Science Standards. It shows the changes in green, however it does not show what the original text of the standard stated, and you can see a copy of this also posted on this page. On April 6th from 3:30 to 5:30 there will be a public meeting at the Department of Education. This meeting will be recorded for those who are interested but cannot make the meeting. The driving documents for the standards revision were a framework for K-12 science education, practices cross-cutting concepts and core ideas, and working with the big ideas of science education. The Committee on a Conceptual Framework for New K-12 Science Education Standards was charged with developing a framework that articulates a broad set of expectations for students in science. The overarching goal of the framework for K-12 science education is to ensure that by the end of 12th grade, all students have some appreciation of the beauty and wonder of science, possess sufficient knowledge of science and engineering to engage in public discussions on related issues, are careful consumers of scientific and technological information related to their everyday lives, are able to continue to learn about science outside school, and have the skills to enter careers of their choice, included but not limited to careers in science, engineering, and technology. The framework is designed to help realize a vision for education in the science and engineering which students, over multiple years of school, actively engage in scientific and engineering practices and apply cross-cutting concepts to deepen their understanding of the core ideas in these fields. Currently, K-12 science education in the United States fails to achieve these outcomes, in part because it is not organized systematically over multiple years of school. It emphasizes discrete facts with a focus on breadth over depth, and does not provide students with engaging opportunities to experience how science is actually done. The framework is designed to directly address and overcome these weaknesses. The framework is based on a rich and growing body of research on teaching and learning in science, as well as nearly 2 decades of efforts to define foundational knowledge and skills for K-12 science and engineering. From this work, the committee concludes that K-12 science education should focus on a limited number of disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts, be designed so that students continually build on and revise their knowledge and abilities over multiple years, and support the integration of such knowledge and abilities with the practices needed to engage in scientific inquiry and engineering design. The committee recommends that science education in grades K-12 be built around 3 major dimensions. These dimensions are science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts that unify the study of science and engineering through their common application across fields, and core ideas in 4 disciplinary areas: physical sciences, life sciences, earth and space sciences, and engineering, technology, and applications of science. To support students' meaningful learning in science and engineering, all 3 dimensions need to be integrated into the standards, curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Engineering and technology are featured alongside the natural sciences for 2 critical reasons: to reflect the importance of understanding the human-built world, and to recognize the value of better integrating the teaching and learning of science, engineering, and technology. The framework represents the first step in a process that should inform state-level decisions and provide a research-grounded basis for improving science teaching and learning across the country. It is intended to guide standards developers, curriculum designers, assessment developers, and state and district science leaders. Science is not just a body of knowledge that reflects current understanding of the world. It is also a set of practices used to establish, extend, and refine that knowledge. Both elements, knowledge and practice, are essential. Dimension 1 describes the major practices that scientists employ as they investigate and build models and theories about the world, and a key set of engineering practices that engineers use as they design and build systems. The term practices is used instead of a term such as skills to emphasize that engaging in scientific investigation requires not only skill, but also knowledge that is specified to each practice. Similarly, because the term inquiry, extensively referred to in previous standards documents, has been interpreted over time in many different ways throughout the science education community, part of the intent in articulating the practices in Dimension 1 is to better specify what is meant by inquiry in science and the range of cognitive, social, and physical practices that it requires. As in all inquiry-based approaches to science teaching, is the expectation that students will themselves engage in the practices and not merely learn about them secondhand. Students cannot comprehend scientific practices nor fully appreciate the nature of scientific knowledge itself without directly experiencing those practices for themselves. The cross-cutting concepts have application across all dimensions of science. These cross-cutting concepts are not unique to a framework for K-12 science education. They echo many of the unifying concepts and processes in the National Science Education Standards, the common themes and the benchmarks for science literacy, and the unifying concepts in the Science College Board Standards for college success. The framework structure also reflects discussions related to the NSTA Science Anchors project, which emphasize the need to consider not only disciplinary content, but also the ideas and practices that cut across science disciplines. The continuing expansion of scientific knowledge makes it impossible to teach all the ideas related to a given discipline in exhaustive detail during the K-12 years. But given the amount of information available today virtually at a touch, an important role of science education is not to teach all the facts, but rather to prepare students with sufficient core knowledge so that they can later acquire additional information on their own. An education focused on a limited set of ideas and practices in science and engineering should enable students to evaluate and select reliable sources of scientific information and allow them to continue their development well beyond their K-12 school years as science learners, users of scientific knowledge, and perhaps also producers of such knowledge. With these ends in mind, the committee developed its small set of core ideas in science and engineering by applying criteria. Although not every core idea will satisfy every one of the criteria, to be regarded as core, each idea must meet at least 2 of them, though preferably 3 or all 4. Specifically, a core idea for K-12 science instruction should have broad importance across multiple sciences or engineering disciplines, or be a key organizing principle of a single discipline, provide a key tool for understanding or investigating more complex ideas and solving problems, relate to the interests and life experience of students, or be connected to a societal or personal concern that requires scientific or technical knowledge, be teachable and learnable over multiple grades at increasing levels of depth and sophistication. That is, the idea can be accessible to younger students, but is broad enough to sustain continued investigation over years. The core ideas develop over grade levels as students increase in their ability to understand greater complexity in concepts. Again, it is expected that students will learn about core ideas as they practice science using the science and engineering practices. As you read the document, you will see grade band endpoints, expectations of which students should understand by grade band. In the elementary and middle school grades, core ideas and cross-cutting relationships were identified by grade band and grade level for Arizona. Care was taken to ensure that all of the core ideas and cross-cutting relationships were included in each grade band. At the high school level, content remained organized around the domains of science, life science, physical science, and earth and space science. As with previous standards, districts will determine which standards fit in a high school course. Science and engineering practices were interwoven with the standards at all grade bands. Working with Big Ideas in Science was written after the framework and the Next Generation Science Standards. This document arose as a response to the rapid change in education in our digital age and to further embrace the interconnectivity of science in daily life. As in the framework, Working with Big Ideas in Science encourages inquiry-based learning and creating connections with daily life. You will see commonalities with the framework as you look at these big ideas. The first 10 ideas are broad concepts that students should have the opportunity to learn before the end of compulsory education. Ideas 11 through 14 are more similar to what we know as strands 1, 2, and 3 from the current state standards. The focus is on the practice of science as well as understanding how science fits into the bigger picture of humanity and the universe. We use scientific practices to make meaning of the universe as well as bettering our condition. Within this context, we understand that nothing exists in isolation. Gaining new understanding and developing new technologies impact the larger world community. Working with Big Ideas in Science also breaks content into age bands and defines exit outcomes. Together, these documents formed the backbone of the committee's work on the new science standards. Downloads of both documents are available in this Canvas course, and I would encourage all teachers to look through these documents as we move towards implementing new standards.